My ex-fiancé served me papers at my promotion party. I'm suing for the ring, the apartment deposit, and emotional distress. My lawyer says I'll win easily. I read the complaint, then smiled and said, "Open the attachment I just sent you." She checked her email. Her confidence transformed to terror within seconds. The restaurant's private dining room had been decorated with congratulations banners when Natalie walked in at 7:43 p.m., carrying a manila envelope and wearing the kind of smile that said she thought she'd already won. I'd been celebrating my promotion to Senior Director of Operations at Vertex Technologies for about 90 minutes, surrounded by colleagues and friends who'd helped me get there. The promotion came with a salary increase to $135,000 annually, a corner office, and leadership of a team I'd been building toward managing for 3 years. My boss, Monica Hendricks, the VP who'd championed my promotion, was mid-toast when Natalie appeared in the doorway. The room had gone quiet as people registered the interruption, recognized my ex-fiancé from photos they'd seen, and watched her walk directly toward me with purpose that radiated through her designer heels and perfectly styled auburn hair. Natalie had stopped 3 feet from my table and extended the envelope. "You've been served," she'd said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "I'm suing you for the engagement ring, the apartment deposit you forced me to lose, and severe emotional distress caused by your abandonment. My attorney says I have an excellent case, and you'll be paying everything I'm owed plus damages." She'd looked around the room at my colleagues with the expression that mixed triumph and vindication. "I hope you all know what kind of person you're celebrating. Someone who breaks promises and destroys people's lives without consequence." Several people had shifted uncomfortably. Monica's face had hardened. My best friend Eric, who'd been my groomsman before the wedding was called off, had stood up like he was ready to physically remove Natalie from the room. I'd taken the envelope calmly, pulled out the complaint, and skimmed the first few pages. The lawsuit alleged breach of promise to marry, demanded return of the engagement ring valued at $12,000, reimbursement of apartment deposit of $3,500 that Natalie claimed she'd lost when I'd broken our engagement, and $50,000 in damages for emotional distress and reputational harm. The complaint painted me as someone who'd pursued a relationship with malicious intent, proposed marriage with no genuine commitment, then callously ended the engagement when Natalie had become inconvenient to my career ambitions. It was fiction, carefully constructed fiction, but presented with enough legal formatting to look legitimate. The attorney listed on the complaint was someone named Jeffrey Strand, with a law office address in Bellevue. I'd looked up at Natalie and smiled. That smile had clearly confused her, because her confident expression had wavered slightly. "You should check your email," I'd said calmly. "I just sent you something with an attachment you'll want to see." She'd pulled out her phone, irritation flashing across her face. "This is pathetic," she'd said. "Whatever you think you have, my lawyer already told me you have no defense. The ring was a gift in contemplation of marriage that you terminated. The apartment deposit was money I lost because of your decision. The emotional distress is documented by my therapist. You're going to pay, and everyone here is going to know exactly who you really are." She'd been scrolling through her email while talking, looking for whatever I'd sent. When she'd found it and opened the attachment, I'd watched the color drain from her face. I'd been dating Natalie Harper for 2 years before I'd proposed in December of last year. We'd met at a tech industry networking event in Seattle, hit it off immediately, and started seeing each other regularly. She'd worked in marketing for a pharmaceutical company, was ambitious and driven, seemed to share my values about building a successful career while maintaining work-life balance. The relationship had felt right in ways my previous relationships hadn't. We'd moved in together after 8 months, signing a lease on a 2-bedroom apartment in Capitol Hill. I'd paid the security deposit of $3,500 and covered the first month's rent while we'd agreed to split costs, 50-50 going forward. Natalie had promised to reimburse me for half the deposit, but it had never happened. There had always been some excuse about waiting for her next paycheck or dealing with unexpected expenses. The engagement had happened at a restaurant overlooking Lake Union, the ring a custom-designed piece I'd spent months planning and 3 months of salary purchasing. Natalie had cried when I'd proposed, said yes immediately, started making wedding plans that same night. We'd set a date for September, booked a venue, started putting down deposits on vendors. I'd been happy in a way that felt complete and certain. This was the person I'd spend my life with, build a future with, create something meaningful together. The cracks had started showing about 3 months into the engagement, subtle at first, but gradually impossible to ignore. Natalie had become secretive about her phone, taking calls in other rooms, texting constantly with people she'd be vague about when I'd asked. She'd started working late more frequently, attending networking events she'd never mentioned before, being unavailable for wedding planning discussions we'd scheduled. I told myself it was work stress. Her company had been going through restructuring, and she'd been worried about her position. The secretive behavior was probably just her dealing with professional anxiety privately, not wanting to burden me with concerns about her job security. But the rationalization had become harder to maintain when I'd noticed charges on our shared credit card for expensive dinners at restaurants I'd never been to, hotel rooms in Seattle when we'd lived 20 minutes from downtown, gifts from jewelry stores I'd never visited. When I'd asked about the charges, Natalie had explained them as work expenses she'd been reimbursed for, gifts for her mother's birthday, stays at hotels for conferences. The explanations had been plausible enough that I'd let them go, not wanting to be the suspicious, controlling partner. The real evidence had come accidentally in May. I'd been using Natalie's laptop because mine was being repaired, and she'd left her email open. A notification had popped up from someone named Jeffrey Strand with a subject line that read, "Tonight at the Alexis Hotel, room 314. Can't wait to see you." I'd felt my stomach drop, that physical sensation of reality shifting beneath your feet. I'd opened the email thread and found months of correspondence between Natalie and this Jeffrey Strand, messages that made clear they'd been having an affair since at least February. The messages had been explicit and affectionate, discussing their relationship, their future together, their frustration at having to hide what they felt. There had also been discussions about me, about how Natalie was staying with me until the timing was right to leave, about how she needed to be strategic about the breakup to protect her financial interests. If you are enjoying this story already, please subscribe to see more stories like this. One email from Natalie to Jeffrey had been particularly damning. She'd written that she'd invested 2 years in this relationship and wasn't going to walk away empty-handed, that she deserved compensation for the time she'd spent with someone she'd realized wasn't right for her, that the engagement ring alone was worth $12,000, and she had ideas about how to make sure she kept it. Jeffrey had responded encouraging her to document everything, to build a case for emotional distress, to position herself as the victim of a failed engagement so she could pursue financial claims. He'd mentioned that, as an attorney, he could help her structure things properly. The emails had made clear this wasn't just an affair, it was a calculated plan to extract money from me when she'd eventually ended the relationship. I'd taken screenshots of everything. Every email between Natalie and Jeffrey going back 4 months. I'd also gone through our shared credit card statements and documented every suspicious charge, every hotel room, every expensive dinner. I'd accessed our joint bank account and discovered that Natalie had been transferring money to her personal account in small amounts over several months, totaling nearly $8,000 that I'd had no knowledge of. She'd been systematically siphoning money while planning her exit strategy. I'd also found text messages on her phone when she'd left it on the counter one evening. Messages to friends discussing her plan to break up with me, to claim I'd been emotionally abusive, to sue for the ring and any other money she could extract. I'd consulted with an attorney that same week. Her name was Rebecca Whitmore, a family law specialist with 16 years of practice in Washington state. I'd shown her everything I'd found, explained the situation, asked what my options were. Rebecca had been blunt. What your fiancé is planning is legally questionable and ethically reprehensible. The engagement ring in Washington is generally considered a conditional gift that should be returned if the engagement ends, regardless of who ends it. Her plan to keep it and sue for additional damages appears to be fraudulent. The money she's taken from the joint account is theft. The conspiracy with her attorney is potentially grounds for professional sanctions against him. Rebecca had recommended I gather as much documentation as possible, end the relationship clearly and definitively, and be prepared for exactly the kind of lawsuit Natalie was planning. I'd ended the engagement in June, 6 months before the wedding. I'd confronted Natalie with what I'd found, shown her the emails, told her I knew about Jeffrey and the affair. She'd denied it initially, then shifted to blaming me for being emotionally unavailable, then finally admitted the relationship but claimed it had only started recently and was a response to my neglect. I'd told her the engagement was over, that she needed to return the ring, that we'd split the apartment costs fairly and go our separate ways. She'd refused to return the ring, claimed it was hers regardless of the breakup, said I'd given it to her freely and had no right to demand it back. She'd moved out 2 weeks later, taking the ring and anything else she could claim was hers, leaving me with the full rent and deposit on an apartment I could no longer afford alone. The lawsuit had been threatened almost immediately. Natalie had sent emails through Jeffrey Strand's law office demanding I pay her $15,000 to avoid litigation. The demand had included the ring value, the apartment deposit, and compensation for wedding deposits she'd lost. I'd refused through Rebecca Whitmore, pointing out that Natalie had the ring and I'd paid the apartment deposit. Strand had responded that his client was the injured party, that I'd broken promises and caused severe emotional harm, that they had documentation from a therapist supporting the emotional distress claim. Rebecca and I had prepared for the lawsuit we'd known was coming, gathering evidence, building our defense, and preparing a counterclaim for the money Natalie had stolen from our joint account and the fraud she'd committed. Now here she was at my promotion party, serving papers in the most public and humiliating way possible, confident that her lawsuit would succeed and I'd be forced to pay. The email I'd sent her contained a single PDF file, 23 pages long, titled Evidence of Fraud and Conspiracy. The document included screenshots of every email between Natalie and Jeffrey discussing their affair and their plan to extract money from me. It included bank statements showing the transfers she'd made from our joint account to her personal account. It included text messages where she'd discussed faking emotional distress and building a fraudulent case. And most importantly, it included a declaration I'd obtained from a forensic accountant named Douglas Greenfield, who'd traced the money and documented the theft. Natalie had been staring at her phone screen, scrolling through the PDF, her face going from pale to ashen. The room was completely silent, everyone watching this drama unfold. I'd continued speaking, my voice calm and clear. That document contains evidence that you and your attorney Jeffrey Strand have been having an affair since February. It shows emails where you discussed using me financially while planning to leave. It shows you stealing nearly $8,000 from our joint account. It shows you and Strand conspiring to file a fraudulent lawsuit to extract money you have no legitimate claim to. The document has been sent to the Washington State Bar Association as a complaint against Strand for professional misconduct. It's also been sent to his law firm's managing partners, and I've filed a counterclaim for the money you stole, the ring you refused to return, and damages for fraud. The confidence Natalie had walked in with had completely evaporated. She'd looked up from her phone, her eyes wide, her breathing rapid. "You were spying on me," she'd said, her voice shaking. "You violated my privacy, hacked my accounts. This is illegal." I'd shaken my head. "I used your laptop with your knowledge when mine was broken. Your email was open. I took screenshots of things I found while using a device you'd given me permission to use. I accessed our joint bank account, which I'm legally entitled to access. Everything I have is admissible evidence obtained legally. What you and Strand did, planning a fraudulent lawsuit while having an affair, that's what's illegal. That's conspiracy to commit fraud. That's theft. That's professional misconduct for an attorney." Rebecca Whitmore had arrived at the restaurant 20 minutes later, called in by my quick text during the confrontation. She'd walked into the dining room in a business suit, carrying her own folder of documents, and introduced herself to Natalie. "Ms. Harper, I'm Rebecca Whitmore, Mr. Kavanaugh's attorney. I'm here to inform you that we're filing criminal complaints for theft and fraud in addition to our civil counterclaim. The evidence my client has gathered shows systematic theft from joint accounts, conspiracy to file fraudulent legal claims, and professional misconduct by your attorney. You should retain separate counsel immediately, someone not involved in the affair or the conspiracy." Natalie had looked like she might cry or vomit or both. She'd turned and practically run from the restaurant, still clutching her phone with my email open. The room had erupted in conversation after she'd left. Monica had pulled me aside and asked if I was okay, if I needed anything, if this would affect my new position. I'd assured her I was fine, that this was a personal matter being handled legally, and it wouldn't interfere with work. She'd seemed satisfied but concerned, like she was seeing a side of my life she'd never known existed. Eric had clapped me on the shoulder and said that was the most badass thing he'd ever witnessed. Other colleagues had offered support, some asking questions I'd deflected politely, others just expressing shock at the drama that had unfolded. The party had continued, but with a different energy, less celebratory and more surreal, everyone processing what they'd seen. Rebecca had stayed for about an hour, sitting with me in a quieter corner of the room and going over next steps. The counterclaim we'd prepared was ready to file on Monday morning. It sought return of the $12,000 ring, recovery of the $7,800 Natalie had stolen from the joint account, and $30,000 in damages for fraud and emotional distress. The evidence package had been sent to the Washington State Bar Association with a formal complaint against Jeffrey Strand for violating professional rules of conduct. Specifically, he'd engaged in a relationship with a client's adverse party, participated in planning fraudulent legal claims, and used his position as an attorney to further a scheme to defraud. Those were all grounds for serious disciplinary action, including potential disbarment. Rebecca had also contacted the managing partners at Strand's law firm, a mid-sized practice in Bellevue called Cascade Legal Group. She'd sent them the same evidence package along with a letter explaining that one of their attorneys was engaged in professional misconduct that could expose the firm to liability. The response had been swift. Within 3 hours, Rebecca had received a call from the firm's senior partner, a lawyer named Patricia Dunham, who'd been practicing for 28 years. Dunham had been appalled by the evidence, had assured Rebecca that Strand would be placed on immediate administrative leave pending investigation, and had offered to facilitate mediation to resolve the underlying dispute. Rebecca had declined mediation, explaining that we were pursuing all available legal and professional remedies given the egregious nature of the conduct. The Bar Association had opened an investigation into Strand within 2 days. The investigator assigned was a disciplinary counsel named Richard Nakamura, who'd been handling attorney ethics cases for 14 years. He'd interviewed me for over 2 hours, asking detailed questions about my relationship with Natalie, the discovery of the affair, the emails discussing the fraudulent lawsuit, and the evidence I'd gathered. I'd provided him with everything, including the original emails, bank statements, text messages, and declarations from the forensic accountant. Nakamura had been thorough and professional, explaining that the investigation would take several months, but the evidence appeared to support serious violations of professional conduct rules. The civil counterclaim had been filed the following Monday as planned. Natalie's attorney Strand had been listed as a defendant, along with Natalie, both of them sued for conspiracy to commit fraud, theft, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The complaint detailed everything: the affair, the plan to extract money, the stolen funds from the joint account, the fraudulent emotional distress claims. It included exhibits showing the emails, the bank transfers, the text messages planning the scheme. When Strand had been served with the counterclaim at his law office, he'd apparently gone directly to the managing partners and resigned effective immediately. According to Patricia Dunham, who'd called Rebecca to inform her, Strand had admitted to the affair and the planning discussions, but claimed he'd never intended to actually file fraudulent claims. That defense hadn't helped him avoid the bar investigation or the lawsuit. Natalie had retained new counsel, an attorney named Valerie Sutton, who'd been practicing family law for 19 years. Sutton had filed a motion to dismiss the counterclaim, arguing that the evidence had been obtained improperly and that Natalie's conversations with Strand were protected by attorney-client privilege. Rebecca had opposed the motion with a detailed brief explaining that I'd accessed information legally, that there was no attorney-client privilege for communications planning fraud, and that the crime-fraud exception applied to any privileged communications. The judge assigned to the case, Honorable Dennis Holloway, with 22 years on the bench, had denied the motion to dismiss. He'd ruled that the evidence was admissible and that the counterclaim stated valid causes of action. The case would proceed to discovery. Discovery had been brutal for Natalie and Strand. Rebecca had subpoenaed all communications between them, all bank records, all credit card statements, all hotel reservations. She'd deposed Natalie for 7 hours, asking detailed questions about every dinner, every hotel stay, every transfer of money, every conversation with Strand about suing me. Natalie had been evasive and defensive, claiming she couldn't remember specific details, insisting the affair had been brief and unrelated to the lawsuit, denying she'd planned anything fraudulent. But the documentary evidence had contradicted almost everything she'd said. Rebecca had introduced email after email showing premeditation, planning, calculation. Natalie's deposition had essentially destroyed any credibility she might have had. Strand had been deposed separately, and his testimony had been even more damaging. He'd admitted to the affair, admitted to discussing legal strategy with Natalie, and admitted that some of their communications had crossed ethical boundaries. But he'd tried to claim he'd never intended to actually file false claims, that the discussions had been theoretical, that he'd planned to advise Natalie properly once she'd formally retained him. Rebecca had demolished that defense by showing emails where Strand had drafted language for the complaint specifically designed to maximize Natalie's damages, despite knowing the claims were exaggerated or false. She'd also shown that Strand had prepared the lawsuit while actively engaged in a romantic relationship with Natalie, creating obvious conflicts of interest he'd never disclosed. The Bar Association investigation had concluded 6 months after the initial complaint. The findings had been damning. Richard Nakamura had determined that Strand had violated multiple rules of professional conduct, engaging in conduct involving dishonesty, fraud, and misrepresentation, having a sexual relationship with a person involved in a matter the lawyer was handling, and using information relating to representation of a client to the disadvantage of another person. The recommended discipline had been suspension from practice for 2 years, with conditions for reinstatement, including ethics training and supervision. Strand had agreed to the discipline rather than fight it, essentially ending his legal career for the foreseeable future. The civil case had gone to trial 8 months after I'd filed the counterclaim. Rebecca had presented a methodical case showing the affair, the planning discussions, the theft of money from the joint account, and the fraudulent nature of Natalie's claims. I'd testified about discovering the emails, about the betrayal of trust, about the financial harm caused by Natalie's theft, and by having to defend against her fraudulent lawsuit. The forensic accountant Douglas Greenfield had testified about tracing the money Natalie had transferred from the joint account to her personal account. A private investigator Rebecca had hired, a former detective named Lawrence Kim, with 23 years of experience, had testified about surveilling Natalie and Strand and documenting their affair with photographs and reports. Natalie's defense had been weak and unconvincing. Valerie Sutton had tried to argue that Natalie had genuinely been emotionally distressed by the breakup, that she'd believed she had valid claims for the ring and deposits, that her conversations with Strand had been misinterpreted. But the evidence had been too strong. The jury had deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning a verdict in my favor on all counts. They'd awarded me return of the ring valued at $12,000, recovery of the stolen $7,800, and $25,000 in compensatory damages for fraud and emotional distress. They'd also awarded punitive damages of $50,000 against both Natalie and Strand jointly, finding that their conduct had been malicious and intentional. The judgment had been financially devastating for Natalie. She'd been forced to return the ring, which I'd immediately sold to recover some of my legal costs. She'd had to pay the $7,800 in stolen money. The damages totaling $75,000 had been split between her and Strand, but Strand had been judgment-proof, having lost his legal career and having no significant assets. Natalie had ended up responsible for most of the judgment. Her wages had been garnished, her bank account seized, her credit destroyed. The lawsuit she'd filed with such confidence, the scheme she'd planned so carefully with her attorney lover, had backfired spectacularly and left her in financial ruin. The professional consequences had extended beyond just the financial judgment and Strand's suspension from practice. Cascade Legal Group had paid a settlement to resolve potential malpractice claims related to Strand's conduct while employed there. The settlement amount had been confidential, but Rebecca had indicated it was substantial enough to make the firm completely reevaluate their ethics oversight and supervision practices. Patricia Dunham had personally apologized for Strand's conduct and had implemented new policies requiring disclosure of any personal relationships that might create conflicts in cases the firm handled. The firm's reputation had taken a hit, mentioned in legal publications as an example of what happens when attorney conduct isn't properly supervised. Natalie's employer had learned about the case through news coverage and had terminated her employment. The pharmaceutical company she'd worked for had a strict ethics policy, and being party to a fraud conspiracy violated those standards. She'd lost her job, her professional reputation, and her ability to work in the industry. Last I'd heard, she was working retail and living with her parents, trying to rebuild from the wreckage she'd created. The affair with Strand had ended shortly after his suspension. their relationship apparently not strong enough to survive the consequences of their choices. Strand had moved to a different state, trying to start over away from the legal community that knew his story. 2 years after that confrontation at my promotion party, I'd largely moved on with my life. The position at Vertex Technologies had been everything I'd hoped, challenging and rewarding, providing opportunities to lead and innovate. I'd been promoted again, this time to Vice President of Strategic Operations, and was being considered for executive leadership positions. The drama with Natalie had become a story I told occasionally when the topic of crazy exes came up, always emphasizing the importance of documenting everything and trusting your instincts when something felt wrong. I'd started dating again, cautiously, with a much better understanding of red flags and the importance of genuine compatibility over superficial attraction. Rebecca Whitmore had become not just my attorney, but a friend. We'd stayed in touch after the case ended, occasionally meeting for coffee or dinner to catch up. She'd told me that my case had become one she referenced when talking to clients about the importance of gathering evidence before confronting a situation. The screenshots I'd taken, the documentation I'd assembled, the methodical way I'd built the case before ending the relationship, all of it had made the difference between being victimized and achieving justice. Without that evidence, it would have been my word against Natalie's, and her fraudulent lawsuit might have succeeded. The moment at the promotion party when Natalie's confidence had dissolved into terror, when she'd realized I had evidence that would destroy her lawsuit and expose her fraud, that had been the turning point. Her assumption that I was unaware, that I'd be caught off guard by her lawsuit, that she'd be able to cry victim and extract money from me, all of it had depended on me being passive and uninformed. The email attachment had shattered those assumptions instantly. Within seconds of opening that PDF, she'd understood that her entire scheme was exposed, that her attorney was compromised, that she faced serious legal and financial consequences. That transformation from smugness to fear had been visible to everyone in the room. Justice in this case hadn't been about revenge or vindication in any petty sense. It had been about holding people accountable for calculated fraud, about ensuring that scheming to exploit someone's trust had real consequences, about protecting myself from being victimized by someone I'd loved and trusted. Natalie had made a choice to betray me, to steal from me, to conspire with her attorney to extract money through fraudulent legal claims. Those choices had consequences. Strand had made a choice to violate professional ethics, to participate in fraud, to use his position as an attorney to further a scheme against someone who'd done nothing wrong. He'd paid the price with his career and his reputation. The lawsuit Natalie had served so confidently at my promotion party had been withdrawn within a week of the email attachment revelation. Valerie Sutton had filed a notice of voluntary dismissal, abandoning all claims against me. But the counterclaim had proceeded, and the evidence had been overwhelming. The trial had been almost anticlimactic because the outcome was never really in doubt once the jury saw the emails, the bank records, the text messages. Everything Natalie and Strand had planned, every fraudulent claim they'd discussed, every stolen dollar, it had all been documented and proven. The justice system had worked, slowly and expensively, but it had worked. Looking back, the relationship with Natalie had taught me important lessons about trust and verification, about the importance of paying attention to red flags even when you wanted to ignore them, about the value of documentation when something feels wrong. The secretive behavior, the unexplained expenses, the sudden changes in communication patterns, all of it had been warning signs I'd rationalized away because I'd wanted to believe everything was fine. When I'd finally investigated, when I'd looked at the evidence right in front of me, the truth had been undeniable. That investigation, that willingness to see what was really happening, had been what saved me from being successfully defrauded. The promotion party confrontation had become legendary among my colleagues. Monica still occasionally referenced it when discussing how to handle difficult situations with grace and preparation. Eric had told the story at his own wedding reception as an example of epic justice moments he'd witnessed personally. New employees at Vertex who heard versions of the story would sometimes ask me about it, and I'd give them the abbreviated version. Trust, but verify. Document everything, and never let someone bully you with false legal claims when you know you're in the right. The story had a life of its own now, probably embellished with each retelling, but the core remained true. Someone had tried to destroy me with a fraudulent lawsuit, and I'd been prepared with evidence that turned the tables completely. If this story keeps your interest, please subscribe to get more stories like this. 3 years after the trial, I'd run into Jeffrey Strand at a coffee shop in Seattle. He'd been working as a paralegal at a small firm, doing document review and research, no longer able to practice law. We'd made brief eye contact, and he'd looked away quickly, shame and embarrassment evident in his posture. I'd felt no anger or triumph in that moment, just a sad recognition that he'd destroyed his own career for an affair and a fraud scheme that had gained him nothing. He'd lost his legal practice, his reputation, his relationship with Natalie, and his financial stability. All of it for what? For participating in a plan to steal money from someone who'd done nothing to him? The consequences had been proportional to the choices, but they'd been devastating nonetheless. Natalie I'd never seen again after the trial. She'd moved out of Seattle according to mutual acquaintances, trying to start over somewhere without the weight of her past following her. The judgment remained enforceable for 10 years, so my attorneys could continue garnishing any wages she earned anywhere in the country. The debt would follow her, a constant reminder of what she'd done and the price she'd paid. I didn't take pleasure in that, didn't enjoy knowing she was struggling financially. But I also didn't feel guilty about enforcing the judgment. She'd made choices, faced consequences, and now had to live with the results. That was justice, not cruelty. The ring I'd sold for $9,000 after getting it back through the judgment. I'd used the money to fund a scholarship at my alma mater for students studying business ethics. The scholarship was anonymous, but I designated it for students who demonstrated integrity and character in addition to academic achievement. It felt like the right use for money that had been connected to such betrayal and fraud. Something good coming from something bad. The rest of the money from the judgment had gone to paying Rebecca's legal fees and covering the costs of the forensic accountant and private investigator. I'd ended up roughly even financially, which was better than the alternative of being defrauded. The emotional scars had healed more slowly than the financial ones. Trust didn't come easily in new relationships after being betrayed so thoroughly by someone I'd planned to marry. I'd found myself being hypervigilant about red flags, quick to question inconsistencies, reluctant to fully commit. A therapist I'd worked with for 6 months, Dr. Laura Pemberton, who specialized in relationship trauma, had helped me understand that those responses were normal, but needed to be managed so they didn't prevent me from building healthy connections. She'd taught me the difference between healthy skepticism and paranoid mistrust, between protecting yourself and sabotaging potential relationships because of past hurts. 4 years after the promotion party confrontation, I'd met someone new. Her name was Julie. She worked in education policy, and she was nothing like Natalie in the ways that mattered. Honest, direct, transparent about her life and her feelings. We'd built trust slowly and deliberately, both of us carrying baggage from past relationships, both of us committed to doing things right this time. When I'd eventually told her the story about Natalie and the lawsuit and the evidence I'd gathered, she'd been shocked, but also impressed by how I'd handled it. "You protected yourself," she'd said. "You didn't let someone victimize you just because they thought they could. That's strength, not paranoia." Her perspective had helped me reframe the experience, see it not as a failure of judgment in choosing Natalie, but as a success in recognizing the truth and responding effectively. The professional success had continued to build. The promotion to VP had led to being recruited by larger companies, opportunities to move into executive leadership at major corporations. I'd chosen to stay at Vertex for now, valuing the culture and the team I'd built, but keeping options open for the future. The financial security that came with career success had also provided peace of mind that no lawsuit, no fraud scheme, no betrayal could destabilize my life the way it might have when I'd been younger and less established. That security wasn't about money alone, it was about having resources to defend yourself, to hire good attorneys, to weather storms that would devastate someone with fewer options. The lesson I'd taken from everything, the one I'd share with anyone facing something similar, was simple. Preparation and documentation matter more than you think, especially when you hope you'll never need them. I'd never wanted to be someone who had to sue his ex-fiancée, or expose her fraud scheme, or destroy her attorney's career. But when forced into that position, having evidence made all the difference. The screenshots of emails, the bank statements, the text messages, all of it had seemed like paranoid overreaction when I'd been gathering it. But in court, it had been the foundation of justice. Without it, Natalie's lawsuit might have succeeded, and I'd have been paying her tens of thousands of dollars for the privilege of having been defrauded. The email attachment I'd sent during the promotion party confrontation, that single PDF file containing 23 pages of documented fraud and conspiracy, had been the culmination of months of careful evidence gathering. Natalie had walked into that restaurant confident in her lawsuit, certain she'd humiliate me and win easily, convinced her attorney had built an unbeatable case. She'd been wrong because she'd assumed I was ignorant of her scheme. The moment she'd opened that email and seen the evidence I'd compiled, all of her confidence had evaporated. Terror had replaced it because she'd understood immediately that she'd been caught, that her fraud was exposed, that everything she'd planned had backfired catastrophically. That transformation had been justice arriving in real time, visible and undeniable, witnessed by everyone in the room. And it had started a chain of consequences that had reshaped her life and ended her attorney's career, all because they'd chosen fraud over honesty, greed over integrity, conspiracy over ethics. The truth won because I documented it carefully and presented it effectively. That was the real lesson. Truth needed evidence to prevail, and evidence required effort to gather. I'd put in the effort, and justice had followed. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.